The massive engineering vessel hovered silently over Arcturus Prime's northern continent, its shadow stretching across red desert plains. Inside the ship's belly, Chief Engineer Dae-ho wiped sweat from his brow as he studied the unusual energy readings on his tablet. For 3 standard weeks, his team had been tracking these strange signals, faint pulses that seemed to originate from deep within the planet's crust. "I'm telling you, this isn't natural," he said, pointing to the rhythmic pattern on the screen. His assistant Yuna peered over his shoulder with skeptical eyes. "Could be just another pocket of crystalline thorium." "We found those all over the eastern ridge last month," she replied, but Dae-ho was already shaking his head. "Thorium doesn't pulse like this. Look at the interval, exact down to the millisecond for weeks on end. That's not geological, that's manufactured." The next morning, under twin rising suns, their excavation drones began cutting through the planet's rocky surface. The team gathered in the command center, watching the feeds as layers of ancient sediment gave way. By midday, the drones hit something unexpected. Not the usual red rock of Arcturus Prime, but something smooth and metallic. "Cut power to the sonic drills," Dae-ho ordered, leaning forward in his chair. "Switch to manual exploration protocol." 3 hours later, Dae-ho stood before a massive door embedded in the rock face, its surface gleaming despite being buried for what must have been centuries. Strange symbols ran along its edges, definitely human script, but in a military code, not used since the first expansion era. "It's a bunker," whispered Yuna, her voice filled with wonder, "from the old war days." The team worked through the night, carefully deciphering the locking mechanism. As dawn broke, the massive door finally yielded with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Stale air rushed past them as lights automatically flickered on inside, revealing a long corridor stretching into darkness. The bunker was surprisingly well preserved, a technological marvel that had maintained power and environmental systems for centuries. They passed rooms filled with old weapons, communication arrays, and tactical displays frozen in time. But it was the central chamber that left them speechless. A single stasis pod occupied the center of the room, surrounded by humming equipment. Inside, visible through a frosted view screen, lay a human figure in perfect preservation. Dae-ho carefully wiped away condensation from the pod's display panel. "No way," he whispered, stepping back. "That's impossible." The pod's occupant was Admiral Tae-won, the legendary military commander whose tactical genius had saved humanity. During the First Galactic War, every schoolchild knew his name, how he'd outmaneuvered the technologically superior Helix Coalition forces despite being outnumbered 10-1. After securing victory, he had mysteriously disappeared, with official records claiming he died during the final battle. Yet here he was, heart rate steady, brain activity minimal but present. "He's alive," breathed Yuna. "The war god of Seoul is alive." A junior engineer, Jin, was examining the stasis pod's control systems. "These are designed to wake him automatically under specific conditions," he said. "There's an emergency protocol tied to a certain transmission frequency, a kind of cosmic SOS that only the highest military command would have access to." Dae-ho paced the room, mind racing. "We need to report this. The colonial authority has to know." The ground beneath them suddenly trembled. Their communication devices simultaneously blared with emergency alerts. Jin frantically checked his tablet. "Something's happening in the outer system," he said, voice rising. "Unidentified. Vessels just appeared near the jump point. Hundreds of them." The team rushed to the bunker's old tactical display. Surprisingly, the ancient system activated, connecting to modern networks. The holographic projection showed Arcturus Prime's orbital space and the swarm of unknown ships. That had appeared without warning. Before their eyes, the alien vessels opened fire on the orbital stations. Defense platforms exploded in silent bursts of light. Civilian transport ships attempting to flee were systematically targeted and destroyed. "They're not even hailing," whispered Yuna in horror. "Who attacks without demands?" The answer came moments later as colonial emergency channels broadcast the first images from other systems. New Moscow was gone. Terra Nova was burning. Earth's orbital defenses were being systematically destroyed by the same unknown fleet, sleek black ships that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. It's happening everywhere, Jin said, his voice hollow. They're hitting all human worlds, simultaneously. A priority message from Fleet Command flashed across their screens. Human forces were mounting a counterattack near Jupiter, gathering every available warship. The footage that followed showed the pride of humanity's fleet engaging the alien armada and being methodically dismantled. Ships designed to fight wars against known enemies were being destroyed faster than targeting computers could lock on. Dae-ho looked back at the sleeping figure in the stasis pod. Admiral Tae-won had faced impossible odds before. The stories said he could see patterns in chaos that others missed, could anticipate enemy movements before they themselves knew their next step. "We need him," Dae-ho said quietly. "But the emergency protocol, we don't have access to that transmission frequency." Another tremor shook the bunker as planetary defenses engaged overhead. Through the tactical display, they watched Arcturus Prime's orbital platforms falling one by one. "We have days, maybe hours, before they reach the surface," Jin said. Yuna stepped forward, looking at the sleeping admiral. "Maybe we don't need the exact protocol. This system is still connected to the colonial network. If we could hack into the emergency broadcast system, we could send a signal on all frequencies," finished Dae-ho, already moving toward the communications array, including the one that will wake him. As Jin and Yuna worked to protect their discovery, Dae-ho's fingers flew across ancient controls, attempting to broadcast a desperate message that might reach not just colonial authorities, but the sleeping war god who represented humanity's last hope. Above them, the sky filled with alien ships descending toward the surface, bringing with them what looked like humanity's final hour. The Void Heralds struck with terrifying precision, their ships, obsidian, spires that seemed to drink in starlight, moved in perfect formation, communicating faster than human systems could track. On New Terra, the colony's defense grid lasted exactly 17 minutes before going silent. Gia crouched beneath her communications console as another explosion rocked the building. Through cracked windows, she could see the capital city burning, black smoke rising against the turquoise sky. The command center was nearly empty now. Most had fled to the emergency bunkers or tried to reach the few evacuation ships that hadn't been destroyed in orbit. "Transmission from Earth Defense Command," called out Captain Hyun-ki from the only other functioning station. His uniform was torn, face streaked with blood from a gash across his forehead. They're gone. Earth's orbital defenses have fallen. The aliens are beginning planetary bombardment." Gia's hands trembled as she tried to maintain connections with the few surviving outposts. 23 human colonies had reported similar attacks in the past 12 hours. None had repelled the invaders. "The Eighth Fleet is completely destroyed," Hyun-ki continued, voice hollow. "Admiral Park's flagship tried to ram one of their command vessels. No effect. The aliens just absorbed the impact somehow." Another explosion, closer this time. The lights flickered and died, emergency power bathing the room in red. Through her headset, Gia heard the desperate final transmissions from neighboring star systems. Pleas for help, tactical data, confused reports about the enemy's capabilities. The aliens seemed to know exactly where to strike, as if they'd been studying human defenses for centuries. "They're targeting our communication relays," Gia said, watching as connections dropped one by one. "They're isolating each world before destroying it." A massive tremor shook the building. Part of the ceiling collapsed at the far end of the command center. Captain Hyun-ki stumbled to her station. "Governor's ordered full evacuation to the deep shelters," he said, gripping her shoulder. "We need to go now." Gia hesitated, fingers still moving across her console. 5 more minutes. I'm trying to compile all the tactical data we've received. Maybe there's a pattern, something we can use." "There won't be anyone left to use it if we stay," Hyun-ki insisted, coughing as smoke began filling the room. As Gia prepared to abandon her post, her system pinged with an unusual notification. An automated subroutine had activated, something buried deep in the colony's original programming. She frowned, opening the file. "Protocol Omega," she murmured, scanning the ancient code. It predated New Terra's founding, hidden in the colonies. Core systems like a digital fossil. "Gia, we need to move," Hyun-ki shouted, already heading for the exit. But she couldn't tear her eyes from the screen. Protocol Omega contained emergency communication parameters and a message template, designed to activate only when human extinction became imminent. At the bottom was a single note: "Last resort, reaches the Sentinel." The building shook again. Through the windows she saw the first of the alien ground forces, sleek bipedal machines with too many joints, moving with uncanny precision through the streets. They fired methodically into buildings, not even bothering to check for survivors. "The Sentinel," Gia whispered. Something stirred in her memory. Old stories her grandfather told. Myths about the war god who disappeared after saving humanity in the First Galactic War. A protector who would return in humanity's darkest hour. Making her decision, Gia locked the blast doors, sealing herself inside the command center. "What are you doing?" Hyun-Ki shouted from the corridor, his voice muffled by the thick metal. "Saving us all, maybe?" she called back. "Get to the shelters, there's something I have to do." Alone now, Gia activated Protocol Omega. The system requested governor-level authorization. Without hesitation, she bypassed security using emergency override codes, redirecting all remaining power to the deep space transmitters. On her screen, a message template appeared with fields for tactical data. Gia worked frantically, uploading everything they'd learned about the Void Heralds, attack patterns, ship capabilities, the systematic way they were exterminating human worlds. The protocol would broadcast on a frequency not used for centuries, supposedly reaching some kind of emergency receiver. Outside, the alien machines had surrounded the building. Through security feeds, she watched them deploying some kind of cutting device against the main doors. She had minutes, maybe less. Gia finished the transmission package, adding a final personal message. "If you're real, War God, we need you now." With trembling fingers, she pressed send. The system hummed, drawing enormous power as it beamed the signal outward, bypassing normal communication channels. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then confirmation flashed across her screen. Signal sent. The doors began to glow red as the aliens cut through. Gia grabbed a pulse rifle from a fallen security officer and took cover behind an overturned desk. She had no illusions about surviving this, but maybe she'd bought humanity a chance. Her thoughts turned to the myths about Admiral Taewon. How? He'd appeared from nowhere during the First Galactic War, turning certain defeat into victory through strategies no one had imagined possible. How he'd vanished afterward, some claiming he'd placed himself in stasis until he was needed again. Light flooded the room as the door finally gave way. The alien machines paused in the doorway, scanning. Their bodies were smooth black metal with pulsing blue circuitry visible beneath transparent sections. Not robots, Gia realized. Some kind of biomechanical fusion. She fired, the pulse blast, striking the lead machine. It staggered back, but only briefly. The others moved forward with cold precision. On her console, a new message appeared, unexpected and impossible. A response to her transmission. "Signal received. Stasis protocols disengaged. Hold position." GR laughed despite herself. Hold position? Against these things? She fired again as the machines advanced, their weapons powering up with an ominous light years away on Arcturus Prime. Ancient machinery whirred to life in a buried bunker. Stasis fluid drained from a pod that had waited patiently for centuries. Inside, Admiral Taewon opened his eyes for the first time in 200 years, his mind already processing the desperate message that had reached him through the darkness. His first words spoken to the empty room as the pod opened. "How many worlds have we lost?" The bunker's systems answered, displaying the catastrophic reports streaming in from across human space. Taewon's expression hardened as he understood the scale of the disaster. Humanity stood on the brink of extinction. The war god had awakened, and his wrath would reshape the galaxy. Admiral Taewon stood before the holographic display, studying the galaxy map with eyes that betrayed no emotion. The scattered blue dots represented what remained of human civilization, fewer than 30 colonies, still transmitting distress signals. Red markers showed confirmed losses, worlds already burned or occupied by the Void Heralds. There were far too many reds. "They're being methodical," he observed. voice steady despite having awakened just 3 days ago. Working inward from the outer colonies toward Earth. Classic encirclement strategy. The small group gathered in the hidden asteroid base watched. Him with a mixture of awe and desperation. They were an unlikely assembly, survivors and outcasts who had answered his encrypted call. Engineers from Arcturus Prime, who had discovered his bunker. Military officers who had escaped doomed ships, and one communications specialist from New Terra who had somehow survived the planet's fall. Gia still couldn't believe she was alive. The alien machines had cornered her in that command center, weapons raised, when suddenly they had frozen in place as if receiving new orders. Moments later, they had withdrawn completely, leaving her confused but alive. 2 days later, a stealth shuttle had extracted her from the ruins, bringing her here. "How did you find me?" she had asked Taewon when they first met. "I didn't," he replied simply. "You found me. The rest was just tracking the source of your transmission and sending the right people to get you." Now she watched as the legendary commander plotted humanity's survival against impossible odds. "Official channels are compromised," Taewon continued, enlarging a section of the map. "Earth's remaining military command is planning a last stand. At Jupiter, they'll gather every surviving warship for one massive counterattack." "So that's good, right?" asked Q, a young pilot who had escaped the destruction of Lunar Base. "Consolidated strength." Taewon's expression darkened. "It's exactly what the enemy wants. Their strategy shows intimate knowledge of standard human military doctrine. They're counting on this response." He gestured, and the display shifted to show tactical data GR recognized, the information she had included in her emergency transmission. "The Void Heralds aren't just winning because their technology is superior," Taewon explained. "They're winning because they can predict our every move, which means we must do what they cannot predict." He tapped commands into the console, and the asteroid base's hidden hangar appeared on screen. Instead of modern warships, it contained vessels that looked positively ancient, mothballed cruisers and fighters from previous eras. "For 2 centuries, I maintained a contingency network," Taewon said. "Hidden bases, outdated but functional ships, weapons that don't appear in any modern registry, equipment considered too primitive to be worth tracking." Gia understood immediately. "They won't be watching for these." Taewon nodded. "The first rule of asymmetric warfare: when outgunned, change the battlefield." Within hours, their ragtag fleet departed the asteroid base in small groups, using obsolete jump drives that the Herald's sensors weren't calibrated to detect. Each team had specific targets, not military objectives, but seemingly unimportant installations throughout human space. Gia found herself aboard a retrofitted mining vessel with Taewon himself, headed toward what had once been a scientific outpost in the Tau Ceti system. The small crew worked in reverent silence around the legendary admiral, who spent most of the journey studying enemy communication patterns. "They use quantum entanglement for primary commands," he explained to Gia during one of their brief meals. "Instantaneous, impossible to intercept, but their ground forces and smaller ships rely on localized subspace channels for coordination." "Can we jam them?" she asked. Taewon smiled faintly. "Better, we can listen. Their encryption is advanced but systematic. I've already identified patterns." 3 days later, they arrived at Tau Ceti, using the system's dense asteroid field for cover. Through the viewport, Gia saw the grim evidence of the Herald's passage, debris fields where stations had once orbited, a once habitable planet now wrapped in artificial storms. "There," Taewon pointed to a small moon orbiting the system's gas giant. "The outpost was converted to an automated relay station 80 years ago. The Heralds will have repurposed it as a communications node." Their ship drifted silently, running on minimal power. As they approached the moon, they spotted Void Herald patrol ships, sleek, angular vessels that seemed to bend light around them. One passed within kilometers of their position but continued without changing course. "They're not seeing us," whispered Q from the pilot's seat. "Their sensors are passing right over us." "They're looking for modern emission signatures," Taewon explained. "Our power core is too primitive to register on their sweep patterns. Under cover of the moon's shadow, they deployed their first weapon, not explosives or energy beams, but..." Specially designed infiltration drones barely larger than a human hand. The tiny machines attached themselves to the relay station's exterior, bypassing modern security to access the ancient human systems beneath. Now we become ghosts in their network, Taewon said as the first data streams began flowing to their ship. Over the next week, similar operations took place across human space. While the Heralds concentrated their forces for the expected confrontation near Jupiter, Taiwan's network established hidden back doors throughout the enemy's communication structure. Reports began filtering back to their mobile command center, successful infiltrations, data captures, even the liberation of small human outposts as Void Herald patrols were lured away by phantom signals. Word spread among surviving humans, whispered messages passed from colony to hidden colony. The war god has returned. Hope, fragile but real, began to grow. The Void Heralds noticed eventually, of course. Their attack patterns became more erratic as they tried to counter an enemy they couldn't see. Ships would arrive at coordinates, only to find nothing but echoes. Supply lines were disrupted by hit-and-run attacks from vessels that disappeared before reinforcements arrived. They're adapting, Jia noted during a strategy session, pointing to changes in enemy patrol patterns. Learning from each encounter. Good, Taewon replied with unexpected intensity. I want them frustrated, confused. I want them to commit to hunting shadows while we prepare the real strike. He enlarged a section of the galactic map, highlighting a particular system that made Jia's breath catch. The Jupiter defensive line falls tomorrow, he said calmly. Earth will be exposed. The Heralds will celebrate what they believe is their final victory over humanity. His eyes, normally so controlled, now burned with quiet fury. That's when we show them the meaning of wrath. The remnants of Earth's defense fleet burned against the backdrop of Jupiter's swirling clouds. Massive Void Herald vessels moved methodically through the wreckage, eliminating escape pods and disabled ships with cold precision. From the observation deck of his commandeered scout ship, Taewon watched the massacre with calculating eyes. We shouldn't be this close, whispered Q, hands tight on the flight controls. Their patrol sensors will pick us up any minute. No, they won't, Taewon replied, eyes never leaving the destruction outside. We've masked our emissions with the radiation from Jupiter's magnetosphere. We're invisible as long as we stay within this orbital band. Jia joined them at the viewport, her throat tight as she watched humanity's last organized military force being systematically eliminated. Those were our best ships, our most advanced weapons. And that was precisely the problem, said Taewon. The Heralds were ready for everything we've developed in the last century. He turned from the viewport, moving to the tactical display where a complex mathematical pattern rotated slowly. But they've revealed something critical in this battle. The display showed communication frequency analyses captured by their network of infiltration drones, pulses of energy in seemingly random patterns. Their ships maintain perfect coordination, despite being spread across multiple systems, Taewon explained. I've been analyzing their command structure for weeks. There's a pattern, a mathematical signature in how they transmit orders. Jia studied the display. It's not random at all. It's cyclical. Exactly. Taewon's fingers traced the pattern. Every 87 seconds, their entire network synchronizes through a central frequency. For just a microsecond, every Herald ship and ground unit is connected. It's how they maintain such perfect coordination across vast distances. Can we jam it? Asked Daeho, the engineer from Arcturus Prime who had joined their growing resistance. Not with conventional methods, Taewon replied, but their defenses against this vulnerability follow predictable rotations. He highlighted sections of the pattern. Here and here, there are mathematical gaps, weaknesses they don't even recognize as weaknesses. 3 days later, representatives from a dozen hidden human outposts gathered in an abandoned mining facility on Ganymede. They were a desperate ragtag group, ship captains without fleets, colony leaders without colonies, engineers and scientists who had escaped the initial purge, all drawn by whispered messages. The war god has a plan. What I'm proposing is not a conventional attack, Taewon explained, standing before the assembled leaders. The Heralds expect us to gather whatever ships we have left, for a final desperate assault on their command vessels. He gestured to a holographic display showing the largest Herald ships currently orbiting Earth. These are decoys. Their true command structure is distributed and hidden. But there is one critical point in their network, a relay node they've established in the Kuiper Belt. It looks insignificant, which is precisely why they believe it's safe. "So, we hit this relay instead of their warships?" asked Captain Nam, an experienced freighter pilot whose ship had been converted to carry makeshift weapons. "We don't just hit it," Taewon corrected. "We use it to introduce a cascading failure into their entire communication network. But to succeed, we need to strike at precisely the right moment, from multiple vectors, with exact mathematical timing." He laid out the plan, a desperate, complex operation requiring perfect coordination between ships that had never trained together, using cobbled-together weapons and repurposed civilian vessels. The assembled leaders exchanged doubtful glances. "This is suicide," muttered someone in the back. "It's our only chance," countered Gia, stepping forward. "I've seen what the Heralds did to New Terra, to dozens of colonies. They won't stop until we're extinct." "And what makes you think this plan will work when everything else has failed?" challenged Nam. Taewon's voice remained steady. "Because we're going to make them think they've already won." The plan unfolded over the following week. Small groups of ships emerged from hiding, launching apparent guerrilla attacks against Herald patrols. They were quickly destroyed, exactly as Taewon had intended. "We're feeding them a pattern," he explained to Gia as they monitored the operations, "making them believe they understand our desperation tactics. Through carefully engineered communications leaks, they let the Heralds discover apparent plans for a major assault against their command ships orbiting Earth. Meanwhile, the real strike force assembled in deep space, using the complicated gravitational dance of the outer planets to mask their movements." Gia found herself aboard Taewon's flagship, a refitted colony transport now bristling with hastily mounted weapons. Their crew included humans from a dozen different worlds, plus a handful of alien allies who had grown concerned about the Herald's unchecked aggression. "Why would other species help us?" Gia had asked when the first alien volunteers arrived, spindly, Nexari with their forearms and crystalline skin structures, and hulking Boros, whose silicon-based biology made them naturally resistant to radiation. "Self-interest," Taewon had answered simply. "The Heralds won't stop with humanity. Others are beginning to realize that." The day of the attack arrived. The diversionary force, consisting mostly of automated drones and a few volunteer pilots, in outdated fighters, launched their doomed assault on the Herald fleet at Earth. As expected, the aliens responded with overwhelming force, pulling ships from throughout the system to crush what they believed was humanity's final, desperate gambit. "They've taken the bait," reported Q from the sensor station. "Herald defensive formations are shifting exactly as predicted." Taewon nodded, his expression grim. "Launch the real attack." From hiding places throughout the outer system, the high-day true strike force emerged. Nearly 200 ships of all shapes and sizes, from mining vessels to colony transports to salvaged military craft. They converged on the seemingly unimportant relay station, floating in the darkness of the Kuiper Belt. The Herald response was immediate and furious. Hidden defensive ships appeared, their weapons already firing. Space lit up with energy beams and explosive detonations. "They're throwing everything at us," called out Daeho as their ship shuddered under near misses. "More defenders than we anticipated." "Stay on course," ordered Taewon calmly. "This is working." Gia gripped her console as another explosion rocked the ship. Through the tactical display, she watched their fleet taking devastating losses. Ships disappearing from the grid one by one. It looked like total disaster. Yet Taewon stood unmoving at the command station, eyes fixed on a countdown timer. When it reached 0, he activated the ship's special communications array, a device they had spent weeks assembling from components scavenged across a dozen systems. "Now," he said simply. The signal went out, not a weapon blast, but a precisely calibrated transmission directed at the relay station. Simultaneously, from surviving ships scattered across the battle zone, identical signals converged on the same target. For a moment, Nothing seemed to happen. Then the relay flared with unexpected energy, its surface rippling with mathematical patterns that precisely matched the frequency vulnerabilities Tae-Won had identified. "Direct hit," reported the communications officer. "Signal penetration confirmed." Through their viewports they watched as the Herald ship suddenly faltered, their perfect formation dissolving into chaos. Some drifted without power, others began firing randomly into space. "What's happening to them?" Gia asked, staring at the unexpected sight. Tae-Won's face showed the first real smile she had seen from him. "We just introduced a recursive error into their hive mind. Every ship in their fleet is now receiving contradictory commands, multiplied exponentially with each communication cycle." The battle wasn't over, far from it. But as the Herald coordination collapsed across the system, Tae-Won turned to his crew with fire in his eyes. "Signal all ships," he ordered. "Execute Phase 2. It's time to take back Earth." The Earth hung like a wounded jewel against the blackness of space, its atmosphere scarred by Herald bombardment. From the command deck of his flagship, Tae-Won watched as the once coordinated alien fleet drifted in disarray around the planet. Their sleek black ships, previously moving with terrifying precision, now tumbled in confusion or fired wildly at phantom targets. The disruption of their hive mind network had worked even better than anticipated. "It won't last," Tae-Won warned his officers as they celebrated the momentary advantage. "Their systems will reset and establish backup protocols within hours. We need to move now." Their ragtag armada, what remained of it after the brutal battle at the relay station, pushed toward Earth at maximum speed. Repurposed mining vessels flew alongside ancient military craft, all bearing hastily mounted weapons and determined crews. GR tracked enemy movements from her station, watching Herald ships attempting to regroup. "They're adapting faster than expected," she reported. "Smaller units are establishing localized communication networks." Tae-Won nodded, unsurprised. "Begin Phase 3. Deep within the ship, Daeho activated a series of encoded transmissions. Across the solar system, dormant. Systems buried on moons and asteroids awakened in response. Tae-Won had prepared these contingencies centuries ago. Hidden weapon platforms and automated defense systems that had remained undetected by modern scans because they used technology considered obsolete. Earth's orbit suddenly blazed with unexpected weapons fire as these ancient defenders sprang to life, catching Herald ships in devastating crossfires. The aliens responded with characteristic aggression, but without their perfect coordination, they couldn't effectively counter attacks coming from seemingly impossible directions. "We've cleared a path to low orbit," announced Q from the pilot's station. "But ground forces are still entrenched across the planet's surface." "Deploy the dropships," ordered Tae-Won. "All ground teams proceed as planned." Gia found herself aboard one of those dropships minutes later, securing her combat gear, as they plunged toward the devastated remains of the North American Command Center. The plan had seemed impossible when Tae-Won first explained it. Small teams targeting key Herald ground installations, while the main fleet engaged their ships in orbit. Yet here they were, attempting exactly that suicide mission. The dropship shuddered violently as Herald defense systems locked on, atmospheric friction turning the hull red-hot. Through the viewport, GR watched other vessels in their formation, hit by enemy fire exploding in brief bright flashes. Her knuckles whitened on the restraint harness. "Brace for hard landing," shouted the pilot as they corkscrewed through anti-aircraft fire. The impact rattled Gia's teeth and threw several soldiers against their restraints. Smoke filled the cabin, alarm klaxons blaring. The rear hatch blew outward, and suddenly they were rushing into open air, weapons ready. They had landed in what once had been a city park, now a blasted landscape of craters and burned trees. In the distance, a Herald ground control center rose like an obsidian spire, pulsing with blue energy. Around it patrolled the same biomechanical soldiers GR had encountered on New Terra, sleek, inhuman shapes, moving with fluid precision. "Remember the plan," said Captain Hyun-ki, who had somehow survived New Terra's fall and joined their desperate resistance. "We're not here to win a direct fight. Plant the devices exactly where Admiral Tae-Won indicated, then get out." They moved through the ruins, avoiding Herald patrols where possible. engaging them in brief, violent skirmishes when necessary. GR had never been a soldier, but weeks of intensive training under Taiwan's surviving military officers had transformed her from a communications specialist into something resembling a competent fighter. There, Hyunki pointed to a specific junction box at the base of the Herald structure. That's our target. GR removed the device from her pack. Not a bomb, but something far more sophisticated. A quantum interface that Taiwan had designed, built from components so old the Heralds had never encountered them. She attached it to the junction, activating the sequence exactly as she'd been trained. "Device planted," she reported into her communicator. Synchronizing now. Across the globe, other teams were doing the same thing at precisely the same moment. Each device individually seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a planetary network designed to interface with something far larger. In orbit, Taiwan received confirmation as the final device came online. His expression remained composed, but his eyes burned with cold fire as he activated the master control sequence. "Begin the protocol," he ordered. Throughout human space, ancient systems hidden in gas giants and dead moons powered up in response. These weren't simply weapon platforms or defensive systems. They were something the Galactic Council had forbidden centuries ago. Autonomous hunter-killer networks designed to identify and eliminate specific targets without restraint. In his quarters before the battle, Taiwan had confessed the truth to GR. "After the First Galactic War, I saw how vulnerable humanity remained. So I created an insurance policy, a final option if extinction ever threatened us again. The Council discovered part of my network and demanded I dismantle it. That's why I went into stasis instead. Now that dormant network awakened, guided by the command protocols Taiwan had just activated. Across dozens of star systems, specialized machines emerged from hiding, immediately targeting Herald vessels with weapons that bypassed their advanced shielding. On Earth, Herald ground forces suddenly froze as conflicting commands overwhelmed their systems. The biomechanical soldiers collapsed, their organic components unable to function when separated from the hive mind. From the command deck of his ship, Taiwan watched grimly as his centuries-old contingency plan unfolded. The network didn't just attack Herald forces, it traced their command signals back to their source, revealing something unexpected. "They're receiving orders from the Galactic Council's restricted zone," reported his sensor officer with shock. "Specifically from the Praetorian sector." Taiwan nodded slowly. "As I suspected, the Heralds aren't a natural species. They're weapons, created by Council extremists who always believed humanity was too unpredictable, too dangerous to be allowed to spread through the galaxy." The battle for Earth continued for 3 more days, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Without their perfect coordination, and with Taiwan's autonomous network hunting them across multiple systems, the Herald forces disintegrated. 1 week later, Taiwan stood in the ruined council chamber on Earth, facing holographic representatives from surviving colonies and allied alien species. Evidence retrieved from captured Herald ships had confirmed his theory. The aliens had been engineered specifically to counter human military capabilities designed by a secret faction within the Galactic Council. "We've won this war," Taiwan told the assembled leaders. "But ensuring our survival requires more than military victory. We need to reshape the galactic order itself." Gia watched from the side of the chamber as the legendary commander seamlessly transformed from warrior to diplomat. The war god who had brought humanity back from the brink now focused on building a future no one had dared imagine weeks ago. Later, as Earth's sun set over the devastated but recovering landscape, she found Taiwan standing alone at a viewport, gazing at the stars. "Will you go back into stasis?" she asked quietly. "Now that the crisis is over?" He shook his head slowly. "My purpose was never just to win a single war. I awoke to ensure we never need to fight another one." He turned to her, his eyes reflecting, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. "Humanity needs to build something better than what came before, something that can withstand whatever the galaxy throws at us next." "And you'll help us do that?" Gia asked. "I will," he promised, his gaze returning to the stars. not with the cold calculation of a strategist, but with the vision of someone who could see possibilities where others saw only chaos. The universe is vast and full of wonders, and humanity's story is just beginning. The end.